Hey, everybody, it's the Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. I am yet again on the road. So you see, I don't have my typical blue background that I miss, actually. But I'm moving around through the world today, speaking as always, as I do, with the thought leaders and CEOs who are moving food systems transformation ahead, moving the needle for people, the planet, and animals. And as we enter into El Nino, yep, it's an El Nino year, I think we're going to see even more climate catastrophes than we have in years past. We're talking about things like mudslides, fires, hurricanes. Floods. I probably don't need to tell all of you. We read about it in the newspaper anywhere from Pakistan spending $30 billion after 4 months of flooding last year. They're trying to prepare for flooding this year. They still have climate refugees leaving Pakistan and being supported by the Pakistani government. Just one example, all the way to across the world to California and Canada for all of its fires. So there's lots to discuss today on just how we address climate system solutions. And we will talk to an expert here. And let me bring on my guest today, the Executive Director of Climate System Solutions, Joel Stone. It's great to have you with me. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Pleased to be on board and hopefully lend some additional education and get people more interested in what can be in store for us to solve the mess that we've gotten ourselves into worldwide.
I know you will add to that. So first, let's level set a little bit. What are you doing at Climate System Solutions? And tell us the work that you do there and what it is.
Okay, I'll give you a real quick background on Climate System Solutions, and we can dive right into that. Climate System Solutions is fairly new. It's a 503c nonprofit. It was founded in December 1st of 2022, so we're new kids on the block. My co-founder, Klaus Magar, both of us had worked with each other on webinars and educational programs at Business Climate Leaders prior to that. And we decided to carry forth with our efforts on talking about the convergence of agriculture and the food supply chain and how that ties in with climate and really, taking a systems approach. So in the words of Klaus and myself, we said, who should we be? Well, we should be Climate System Solutions because our perspective is we have to take a systems approach. It's very complex retooling the supply chain worldwide. So we provide educational services, advisory services, helping people connect the dots.
Wonderful. So you and I both come at this. So climate system solutions, one might say, oh, well, it's alternative energy. Others might say, oh, well, it's really electric vehicles. Some might even say alternative building materials. But you and I would both say, okay, one needs to approach this, one being major governments around the world, but also business leaders and current industry leaders and even consumers, let's say. We need to address this from a food systems approach because food, we look at animal factories putting out 1/3 of the world's global methane emissions, for example, methane being a shorter greenhouse gas emission, shorter lifespan than, let's say, something like carbon emissions. So if one doesn't address the methane number, it's going to be hard to really have a systems approach that would be meaningful in the time that we need it. So since we both look at this from a food systems approach, maybe you can tell me through this educational work that you do at CSS, Climate System Solutions. First, let's level set for everybody. Define, if you will, or explain what regenerative ag is and why that's one of your foci.
That is always it's a very good lead-in question. There's a lot of different opinions. There's a lot of different definitions of regenerative agriculture. And we have actually gravitated towards going back to the roots of why we got interested in regenerative agriculture. And the easiest way that I find to define regenerative agriculture is soil carbon capture sequestration. Because really the heart of regenerative agriculture is undergoing practices that increase the soil organic matter so you can have higher water absorption in the soils. reduce fertilizer requirements in the soils, and basically return the soils back to having a healthy microbiome. The microbiome primarily being the organic matter in the soil that's actually living and thriving, and that allowed our soils to be healthy, years and years ago during indigenous farming.
Mm.
you know,
So,
so that's the simplest way I try to boil it down to. And I've in speaking at conferences, the feedback I've got was, Joel, you've got to talk about this differently so people understand what it is. So I'm going to be at a conference, as an example, in November, chairing a panel, and the title of it is Soil Carbon Capture Sequestration.
yeah, really bringing it down to the basics for people, because I fear that this conversation around regenerative ag is going through its own tobacco greenwashing moment, ESG green. I mean, all these attacks that are coming on.
Yeah.
So as we dive into this, I'd like to just first of all point out to everyone that you do have a background in synthetic biology, and biochemical engineering and chemical engineering. So you come at this from a science standpoint, and you come at this also from a synthetic biology standpoint. Okay, we're going to get to all that. But first, I want to break down what regenerative ag is and what it isn't, and see if we can disentangle what I'm already seeing on social media, which is regenerative ag folks attacking plant-based innovation folks and vice versa.
Yeah.
And I don't understand why, because the fact is regenerative agriculture is often plant-based. Now, not 100%. We will disagree on some stuff, Joel, but primarily it is a way of bettering the soil to capture carbon and retain more water, just like trees capture carbon. You correct me if I'm wrong on this, Joel. Just like trees would capture carbon, we can capture carbon in the soil. We can generate that health and microbiome, just like in our stomachs, of the soil, and we can have it work for us and with us by holding on to more water. Now, things like cover crops, like legumes and beans, wouldn't they do this, Joel?
Yes, they do, and that's a great lead-in, because one way that I typically talk to people about regenerative agriculture is talk about the 5 core principles of regenerative agriculture, which I think across the board everybody agrees on, but they don't always agree on some of the subsets on which one's most important. But they basically revolve around minimizing soil disturbance, which is no-till practices, as an example.
Okay.
Maximize crop diversity, which is moving out of typical rotations of crops and moving into more diverse growing of crops to increase diversity, not just in the crops, but really the diversity in the soil itself. Then keeping the soil cover crops, as you just mentioned, maintaining a living root in the ground year round. Again, that ties in with cover crops, retaining moisture year round. And then the last one, the last of the 5 core principles, which in reality, if you look back in time, was a core principle, is integrating livestock. And there's where you get some of the livestock and grazing people having a different opinion on the straight ag people that are just growing crops. But bottom line, those 5 core principles will yield you 3 key outcomes: improving soil health, it'll foster biodiversity, and most importantly, it does promote economic resilience in farming communities. Mm-hmm. And most people forget about the economic resilience, because that allows us to foster community development, food supply chains, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. I want to get to economic resilience in a minute. Of course, we're always thinking about farmers on this show and beyond, but I also want to be realistic about what we mean when we say farmer. Let's face it, the majority of the land is owned by the 4, 5, 6 food conglomerates, and the small farmer has it very tough. They do not have good working conditions, good contracts with those large corporations, and there are fewer and fewer working small family farms. So, I'll see newspaper articles in the New York Times saying, oh, this family farm of 18,000 cows was burned in a fire. So 18,000 cows, that's an industry, in my opinion. Okay, but before we go down that tunnel, because I'll get there in a second, economics and working for the farmer, to bring back that farmer's livelihood. The top 4: minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing crop diversity, cover crops, and living roots in the system. It seems to me that here we align quite well, in that the monocropping that we have is all to feed animals. That's food being grown that has fiber and protein, like soy, and it's being fed to animals, not to people. So it seems to me that to really have crop diversity, one would have to do away with an animal-based system as a majority system. Would that be accurate?
I would twist it a little bit to, to say that what we need to do is integrate raising of animals back into communities rather than massive CAFO programs. Because then you can return organic matter at the local level. I mean, if you've got a massive slaughterhouse or raising massive amount of poultry, whatever, in these huge complexes, you really can't holistically, get the nutrients back to the communities, back to their origination points. And I think that's something people lose sight of.
Yes. I think on this show, we might be well aware of that the CAFOs really destroy the land and destroy the communities around them as well. Domestic violence, alcohol abuse, PTSD, all of these things encompass or enshroud a community that is centered around a slaughterhouse. But, if we were to follow that line of thinking, which I guess gets us to number 5, integrate livestock into soil regeneration, if you will, let's say the hooves of cows that are naturally churning up the soil and keeping that lively, let's say, for lack of a better expression, you wouldn't be able to feed the world with that kind of system, because that's why CAFOs exist. It's there to put out, it's there to try to solve, and it has failed, the following equation. We must feed more people more nutritiously in a shorter amount of time, using fewer resources, creating less damage. So for the very fortunate, let's say maybe elite communities that can have farm animals in a lovely setting and have them work with the soil, this is great for those communities. I'm happy for them, but it won't help the 4 billion people that are increasing our global population according to the United Nations in Africa. So I don't know what you think about that.
Well, there's again, if we don't get limited of just saying the only way we can get protein is from beef or from poultry, and we start looking at globally, what are some of the most efficient ways of delivering protein? I can put on my synthetic biology hat, my fermentation hat, and say, you know what, I can make some pretty phenomenal high protein ingredients that can be used in a myriad of been blended meat products and shakes, fermented milk, much like a brewery. I mean, it can be done at large scale and be done very economically with very low water inputs. So there's a multitude of ways of getting there if we look at running our machinery and running our businesses on all cylinders. It's like the argument I see all the time. It's like shooting missiles back and forth between the beef grazing industry, the grass-fed beef industry, and shooting missiles over at the precision fermentation industry. They can both work together. In fact, I've been working on a project for some time, which is a blended meat product that you can't even tell the difference between a full beef patty And this particular one is 30% fermented protein,
Mhm.
and top chefs can't tell the difference.
It's so
It tastes-
amazing. Both of us are consulting with
Yeah,
large multinational clients as well as smaller clients on this food systems transformation. I
yeah,
do a lot of this work in the investing community, helping them find sustainable
yeah,
investments through food systems transformation, as well as startups and helping them get those sustainability numbers through better ingredients and going to market with these kind of very cool products. So we're going to talk about tech in our food in just a second because I love that you brought it up. But, if you and I are sort of in the Venn diagram of life, maybe let's say 80% aligned, everybody listening on this show, never fear. I'm not advocating that we stick with animals, but I am underscoring that I love what Joel says, and that it's basically, I'm paraphrasing you, Joel, going to take all hands on deck. So it's ridiculous to think that we'd switch over the global food supply system, $8 trillion worth, 1.4 trillion of meat alone in a day. It's gonna, we have to keep feeding people while we're changing the system. It's like driving while you're turning. We have to slow down one, that would be CAFOs, and we have to slowly move towards the other, and that would be cover crops of legumes and soil health, etc. And there's going to be that working together of systems in the middle, which is why, just like you, I don't like to see these shots being fired across the
yeah.
bow from, it's just ridiculous and a waste of energy. So what's it going to take to get all hands on deck, since we both agree that that's what it needs?
It's taking a systems approach, exactly what Klaus and I have launched off to do in Climate System Solutions. We don't try to pick a winner, or lots of times we'll tell people, our role is to manage projects and to help multiple children play friendly with each other in the sandbox.
Good luck.
It's very difficult to do, to have help people figure out how they can cooperate, and that you don't need to point the finger and say one of us has to be the winner and loser, because if we do that, the loser is going to be
Everyone.
everyone. It's going to be humankind. I mean, when I talk to people about climate change and issues with climate, I said, climate by far is our existential enemy. It's really a mess right now. But right on the heels of it, by 2050, is food security and supply.
Of course.
So
That's happening now, actually.
so you can't separate the two. And in Reality Ranch, last year and this year, with all the disasters that are occurring over and over again, and it's getting worse. It's not getting better. How are we going to feed the people that we've got to feed? And now, if you look at temperatures this last week in Arizona and Italy, hitting near 120,
Yeah.
Humankind cannot survive unless
Yeah.
you've got infinite amount of energy to do air conditioning everywhere.
Right.
So
Yeah. It's going to take all hands on deck, and it's going to take all hands on deck now, which is why it's
yeah.
so frustrating for me to see these kinds of conversations. I see them in the investment world as well.
Oh yeah.
When I talk about plant-based innovation and how we are forging a path for sustainable investing through food systems transformation, and plant-based innovation as a foundational pillar, I immediately get attacks within the sustainability investing community saying, well, we only do, local animals. Well, that's wonderful if you're Vermont, but that's not wonderful if you're India. So,
Right.
I mean, and let's be realistic. And the attacks on the same side of the team seem to really make no sense for me. Okay, well, you talked about technology, and you come to this from a technological standpoint, being a chemical engineer and a biochemical engineer. You might not be able to tell us more about that hybrid product you're working on, but if you could, I'd love to hear it. And I'd also love to hear your perspective on what kind of role technology is going to play here.
The role of technology is going to be extremely important. That's what led me into the area of regenerative ag, and really combining what's happening in synthetic biology with what is happening in agriculture and what's happening with the climate. they all go hand in hand. So you'll hear all the buzzwords, which I wish there's better ways to not use them, but you hear precision ag, smart ag, all these different terminologies that, again, it adds confusion rather than, try to boil that down into such things as precision ag is doing what a lot of farms are doing now. They're using technology to measure soil moisture, to determine harvest time, to manage moisture, to manage irrigation. More and more farms are now investing in use of technologies to reduce fertilizer inputs. With the big increase in fertilizer over the last 2 years, more and more people are taking on such things as like the company Pivot Bio that has an organism that will affix nitrogen out of the atmosphere into the soil.
Mm-hmm.
And over a number of years, you have organisms that are actually can replace the synthetic fertilizers. I many times share with people, there was a new world record in corn yields last year. It was over 630 bushels an acre by a farmer who, guess what? He practices regenerative agriculture. His soil health is so phenomenal. His fertilizer inputs, getting those kind of yields was very, very small.
But here you're talking about tech in, let's say, the system, which I agree with. What about tech, for lack of a better expression, in our food? What do you think about that? For example, the USDA just approved cultivated meat for sale about a month ago. What do you think about that?
Mixed emotions. I personally think that cultivated meat, the economics long term are really not going to make sense. I wish I could say otherwise, but being an expert in fermentation, industrial biotech, it's a very difficult approach to take and sustain. It doesn't mean, and when I say it's going to have a place, it's not going to become a replacement for everything else. And I think that's where we let ourselves sort of get lulled into what's going to be the flavor of the month. I mean, if you look 3 years ago at the amount of investment that went into Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, they're nowhere near where they thought that they would be because the quality wasn't there. The ability to produce at scale wasn't necessarily there. So they've sort of, if you rode their stock up, good for you. But if you held on to it, not so good for you today, probably.
So I have lots of thoughts about that. I think in a way I look to the investment community for a bit of smarts and leadership here. They tend to grab on, I'm talking about venture investing, not Wall Street. They tend to grab on to what's going to, the egos get caught up in, I want to be with a unicorn. I want to be able to put that on my resume. I want that so badly. So they're going for, let's say, cultivated meat as the answer to the world's problems. And ultimately, the consumer doesn't function that way. The consumer, and studies have shown this, the consumer is looking at, 40%. They did a study anticipating what the asking the consumer what they would buy in the future. And they said 40% cultivated meat, 40% regular meat, and 20% plant-based meat. And even out of that, I would say you'll have lots of hybrid products in and around and between all those things. So there's not like there's only one way to have food system transformation. You're going to need it all. You look at the grocery store and you're not looking at replacing one product. You're looking at replacing, 50% of the grocery store needs alternatives, and all of the tastes and flavors and enhancements, et cetera, of those products would go along with it. So I don't see cultivated meat as the answer, but I do see it, and I'm not an engineer, I do see it's too early to call its future. I mean, it just is going to take the innovation. It's going to take the CapEx spending like we do with alternative energy. We spend in the trillions. Right now, we spend in the billions, low billions, by the way, in food innovation. You're just going to have to spend CapEx against it, and it's going to have to be developed. What do you think?
Yeah, it's like any industry. It's in its infancy. And we got to recognize it's in its infancy. And you made your point of everybody's looking for the next unicorn. Well, we seem to be in this cycle that we have these unicorns that show up, but 3 years later you go, where's that unicorn now? It suddenly disappeared. I've seen that in industrial biotech over the years. The companies that are around today that I saw at conferences 10 years ago are far few and in between.
Yeah.
Probably less than 10%.
I love that you say that, because I also, you look at the electric vehicle, which has been around from the 70s. It's only now, 50 years later, is it being tweaked and perfected. So you see that very long innovation curve. So these plant-based innovations, be they cultivated meat or even looking at Beyond Meat, they haven't been around for that long. And Beyond Meat, I also think has had maybe a little bit of an unfair criticism in the press, most definitely, but also, I'm not sure that Wall Street looked at it like a consumer staple. I think they maybe valued it, and the company perhaps pushed for this. They valued it as a tech company, and ultimately, you can't say that it's an electric vehicle. It's a food staple, and so it's going to act more like a food staple. So, we're figuring it out as we go. So, have you ever tried cultivated meat, and would you?
Yes, I have, and I will continue. I continue to try things. I'm not set, in one particular kind of thing. I can assure you, I'm not going to become a vegan. I do like my meat, so I'm going to continue eating meat.
Okay, so you are making the point that cultivated meat has to find a home. You're saying it's going to be tricky for it to find a home, and I'm saying it has to. We're going to have to put capex behind that, because you're not going to be able to give people meat. And you yourself know the climate system solution. You know the climate impact of that meat, and you still want it. I'm not blaming you for this. I'm just saying you are like everyone. That's what everybody wants, and so we're going to have to figure that out.
Well, we have to figure out the supply chain. How do you deliver those things? And we've been living with very mature supply chains for moving soybeans and moving corn around and moving oil around. Now we got to move to supply chains that are moving smaller quantities of things around, and are sort of regional oriented. Food products that are oriented towards certain regions, that you can grow things in certain regions and transport them economically, where the days of producing something in a mega plant on the East Coast and selling it on the West Coast, I think, are gone. I mean, just the transportation costs and storage and logistics are insane. And that gets even more complex when you're looking at moving things around the world. So that's where this whole supply chain and systems approach, how to get reoriented, talking to, spend a lot of time talking to small branded companies in terms of their supply chain. What are their raw materials? Where are they going to locate their plant? What can they do to improve efficiency in raw materials? Can they use alternatives? Could they use for their protein source, rather than using soy, might they be better off using barley protein or wheat protein, small grains, which are, and believe it or not, in the U.S. are starting to make a comeback. People growing small grains, because some of them serve as cover crops.
I see this point of a sustainable ingredient list. Of course, I see this point, but I don't see that we're feeding Africa by people focusing on smaller local production. I think the answer to that is vertical farms, greenhouses, and cultivated meat, or bioreactors of precision fermentation, and growing large quantities of protein in very controlled situations, using less land, less water, no hormones, no antibiotics, no deforestation required, etc. So that, emerging countries can get the meat that they want. They feel like they finally deserve it. They're coming into middle class for the first time. Africa, India, China, they want meat, and we're not going to be able to supply that meat. And they want it like you want it. And, who are we to say, no, you can't have it now. So it's an equation to be figured out.
Well, interesting enough, it's great that you brought up Africa and India and some of these other locations. I'll throw in Australia in there, because when I talk about soil carbon capture sequestration, many of those countries have been deforested or have become deserts because of over fertilization, not taking care of the land. And some of the leading experts in the world, which are exploring, returning soil organic matter and basically converting deserts back into valuable farmland. It's being done in Africa on a small scale right now, but it's starting to enlarge. One of the leading countries in the world in soil carbon sequestration, and a lot of the experts in that space are in Australia, because Australia is, much of Australia is desert. It's not, which is a lot is getting converted back over, because you've got to have grazing lands to even raise grass-fed beef, which is a big business in Australia. Grass-fed beef is mammoth.
It's a huge business, but it's also grass-fed beef and other kinds of beef responsible for 41% of the world's tropical deforestation and 1/3 of the world's methane emissions. So, it's going to, from my perspective, it's going to take all hands on deck. And regenerative ag, for me, as a mathematical equation, works if you cut the global population by 50%. We're not doing that. We're increasing it by 25%, from 8 billion to 10 billion. So I love that there are more farmers potentially in Africa, and there are more community farms, and that this exists. Remember, we said it's going to take all hands on deck.
Yeah.
But it's just not, I just don't see it as an equation for feeding the 10 billion that are going to be on the planet, according to the United Nations, by 2050. Okay, let's wrap up here as we get to some final questions. And I just want to point everybody to the screen, the website scrolling across the bottom, climatesystemsolutions.org. So you can always find Joel and hit him up for some deep knowledge, which he has. And I'm going to do that right now. So with your biochemical engineering background and all the consulting work that you do, maybe you could talk about the predictions that you see in the next 3 to 5 years in terms of technology. What's going to stick in the marketplace?
I think from a technology standpoint, and speaking, and I want to speak specifically to North America, we are entering into a renaissance for industrial biotech. What we've seen happen in the past with IT, computers, cell phones, whatever, we're seeing the same thing is starting to happen in industrial fermentation. When I say industrial fermentation, I'm going to talk about pharmaceuticals. I'm talking about protein products. I'm talking about drinks. I'm talking about things that are not just protein, but contain bioactives. So you have the healthy attributes of the food that you eat. So I think I have a tagline on one of my on one of my signatures that I talk about, Hippocrates saying that medicine is food and food is medicine. I think we're entering into that area. The amount of effort now, and even in healthcare, to be talking about dietary practices, looking at what you're eating, looking at quality of eating. You look at some of the groups that now we have technology that we can actually measure the nutritive density of fruits and vegetables. That's how far things have gone on sensory kinds of things that can be done for someone like me, who's a food geek and an engineer. It's interesting to say, hey, I can pick up that strawberry and know if this strawberry was grown under better practices than this other strawberry. And by the way, when I taste each one of them, I can actually notice a difference.
Yeah, I love that you say this. So many cool things there. I think that transparency in the supply chain, that you're going to be able to tell which strawberry was grown where and how and in what kind of soil, is so very cool. I see, of course, more and more AI in food. You have,
Yes.
in fact, if you'd like to, folks listening to this, read the newsletter that I put out on the VegTech Invest LinkedIn page about AI and food innovation. You have companies like Ingredion and Givaudan and Notco and Climax Foods, all focusing on really harnessing nature and everything that nature has to offer through AI mining, if you will, to come up with novel ingredients for alternative proteins. So very interesting. And then I also think it's interesting. A previous episode of the Plant-Based Business Hour, the North Carolina Food Innovation Lab was talking about this maybe 8 months ago, that fermentation, be it classical fermentation, like you ferment kimchi or yeast,
Yeah.
to biomass fermentation or precision fermentation, these kind of all these fermentation technologies are being really brought to the forefront for the health benefits, like classic fermentation, or harnessing the fermentation that already exists from companies like AB InBev, largest fermenter in the world. They're making beer, but they're also making bio brew alternative proteins. So it's interesting to see what kind of novel proteins we're going to get in the marketplace.
Oh, exactly. And the main holdback, and again, looking at trends, I think we're going to see a significant amount of build out of fermentation capacity to make these things. Because that's the bottleneck right now. We don't have fermentation capacity to do the things that all these new startup companies are thinking of doing. And I noticed that several weeks ago you had Mark Warner, who's a good friend of mine, with Liberation Labs was on. Well, he's tackled that to say, hey, we're going to build out a facility that can start doing contract fermentations for these startup companies. There's a program that's supported by the DoD called BioMade. And BioMade is a consortium of companies and universities that are identifying how can we build out fermentation capacity in the U.S. because no, we're not going to be able to feed the world with just farming and agriculture. We're going to need a lot of other vertical farming. We're going to need fermentations, and it crosses all the different business segments. And Climate System Solutions, we talk to all the business segments because it's not just ag. I mean,
right, of course,
we're all interlinked, we're interspliced, and unless we understand those interlinkages and start working with each other in the sandbox, it's going to be pretty challenging. And we have geopolitical issues worldwide that compound it, that don't make it any easier. So.
Yeah. I mean, food insecurity is an issue of national security, and food IP is going to be an issue of national security. I think that's why you see the Biden administration putting out their biotechnology and biomanufacturing technology, both biotech and biomanufacturing tech goals. And it includes alternative proteins, fermentation, plant-based innovation. All of that is in there because you're going to want to, with these shorter food supply chains, you're going to want to have control of your own IP to feed your own nation. Yeah. It's a very interesting, it enshrouds the entire conversation, let's say. Okay, as we wrap up here with a couple quick answers, just these are meant to be sort of one-word answers or one-sentence answers on your way out. If you're having a bad day and things aren't going the way you would like, what is the phrase you say to yourself to get yourself back in the groove?
Persistence.
Well, that's certainly needed in food systems transformation.
That's what's gotten me where I'm at. Whenever someone says, what's your code word? And I was just talking to one of my clients the other day. He sent me an email, and it was like 11 o'clock at night. And I actually called him. I said, I called him and say, hey, I just want to let you know I'm here. You got to keep doing what you're doing. You got to be persistent. And the plant will get up and be running before you know.
Isn't that wonderful? That kind of nice.
And he thought it was crazy. I said, hey, if I figured if you're sending me a text message, you're still up, so I'm going to call you.
Oh my God. That's wonderful. Okay, you're running around, or it's 11 o'clock at night. You never had time for dinner because you're working so hard. What is your go-to snack?
My go-to snack? Well, there's actually two. One is popcorn.
Me too.
I love popcorn and a lot of butter on it. And believe it or not, the other is I found this one brand of meatballs that are fantastic. They're like an Italian meatball, and I can heat them. They're this big around. I can heat them up in the microwave, and you just pop them in.
Joel.
They've become a bad habit in our household.
I have got things to say to you. First of all, popcorn is best with olive oil. So, olive oil and rock salt. Think on that one. And then Beyond Meat does do a very mean meatball. And I also make a very mean meatball. So, and meatballs are coming from other organizations than Beyond Meat. So stay tuned for that fermented meatball because it's going to be, as we both have discussed, in our future. I want to thank you, Joel Stone, the Executive Director of Climate Systems Solutions, for being on the Plantbased Business Hour with me. We're both consultants in this area. We overlap quite a bit. And then we also don't. I'm more on the investing side, but I'm also on the production side with smaller organizations and a lot of C-suite advisement on where the industry's going and where the white spaces are. So if I can help you in any way, you let me know and I will reach out to you for the same. This is where we sign off. I don't want you to go anywhere, but everybody else watching us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, I will see you next week. I'm now back from vacation and sort of back. I'm getting back. So I'm back to my regular schedule Tuesdays at 1:00. So you can kind of look for consistency there. And thanks, Joel. Stay put. Everybody else, I'll see you next week. Bye,
Thank you so
everybody.
much, Elizabeth. Take care, everybody.